future of Africa's economy and ecosystems are very linked and connected. Almost a quarter of the continent's GDP depends on nature. Here in Rwanda, to provide that context, 80% of the population lives in rural areas, and the majority depend on the land for their livelihood. There is simply no development pathway that does not rely on responsible use of the continent's natural assets. Yet, Africa's natural capital is under severe threat from expanding populations, over-exploitation, and the destruction of habitats. Between 1970 and 2016, the stock of natural capital in African countries fell on average by 65%. That's an alarming figure. This is an issue for all of us in this room and those watching online. And sustainability or sustainable economic growth will surely depend on our ability to conserve our natural capital by switching the flow of both private and public finance towards investments that are based on its responsible use. For financial institutions, the first step on this journey is to be able to understand their exposure to nature-related risks. This is the motivation behind the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, a global initiative to create a framework for managing and reporting on the risks and opportunities of nature. So, but what will TNFD on nature-related financial disclosure, not to be charged 1,000 shillings, a global initiative really that is there, but what does it mean for African institutions and governments? How can we ensure what could become the international standard for nature-related or nature risk disclosure recognizes the African context and does not end up becoming a barrier to investment? Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be discussing these and other questions with experts from both public and private sector. We will also hear about the launch of the new organization called the African Natural Capital Alliance, led by some of Africa's leading financial institutions, along with UNECA and our sister financial development agency, FSD Africa, which will help financial institutions, treasury departments of different governments, and regulators to integrate the risks and opportunities tied to the African natural capital.
So it doesn't have to require lots of money initially, but it is an important topic because fundamentally adaptation, financing adaptation is a governmental preoccupation. The private sector is not funding adaptation. A bit of a holy grail in the future is that we might find models of financing through the private sector for adaptation, but that's not happening at the moment. And we know anyway that Africa is not receiving anything like as much money as it needs for addressing climate change, and only 5% of what it's getting at the moment is actually for adaptation. So the numbers are really very small. For me, I think the main issues here are as follows. Firstly, if you don't act now, it's going to be a whole lot more expensive later. So organizations like the Global Center for Adaptation, UNECA, many others have done the cost-benefit analysis, and they're coming up with figures between 2 to 1 or 10 to 1 in terms of the benefit now of acting to invest in adaptation versus the cost later on. So it's going to be a lot more expensive later on. The second point is that nature is all around us. So all the decisions that you make that affect economic development have a bearing on nature. It's impossible to actually disentangle the two. So you can't, as a decision maker, say, oh, nature, I'll do that next week. It's just not an option. Nature is part of us today, and it's obviously the foundation of our economy. So everything that we have to kind of integrate much more this notion of nature. Fixing the economy and fixing nature is really part of the same enterprise. The last point is really that it's a good news thing as well. I just wanted to end on that particular point. So nature is a fantastic economic opportunity if we're having to look at it only as an economic thing, right? So there are all sorts of ways that nature can deliver on the jobs that we need, and nature can provide all sorts of channels for boosting competitiveness at the economic level as well. And so it's worth spending time thinking about how that could happen.
I think the financial sector can actually do quite a lot in order to fast track and protect natural capital on the continent. And we could do that by channeling financial flows towards natural capital. But the key issue with that, and the reason why it's been so slow, is because the financial sector hasn't taken the time and the initiative. They have, in most cases, it's still fairly new, but to understand natural capital risk. And the call to action is for financial institutions to start understanding natural capital and what it is and the related interdependencies that exist, because it is the bare bone and the bedrock of our economies, especially on the African continent. So work needs to be done in this regard. We need to start putting our heads together and trying to understand and account for natural capital. It's one of the main reasons why for the longest time natural capital has been overutilized. It's because it hasn't been costed for, and we've now reached thresholds way beyond return. So if we come together and pull together and try and understand and cost for natural capital, cost for it in our risk management, cost for it in our portfolios, that way, and actually also get to understand what the net positive and net negative natural capital impacts are of our portfolios, that will actually help us identify how to mitigate against those risks, cost and price for that natural capital in our financial solutions, and that will also help us fast track the process of incentivizing activities that are net positive on natural capital, and this is incentivize and also manage our risk in terms of exposure.
The first thing perhaps to point out is that already in Africa, 62% of the African population depend on ecosystem services. And that means the link is very direct, perhaps much more in more developed economies, where you are going directly to the natural environment to source food, to source fuel, to source energy, to deal with your subsistence needs. And that means that the impact as well of, for example, climate change is more immediate and more direct. If we look at the recent storms that battered Eastern Africa, the Indian Ocean, I think particularly Madagascar was hit, around the same time, you also had heavy storms that were hitting Europe. The toll in the African countries was, in some cases, such as Madagascar, over 100,000 people displaced. Whereas in Europe, because you've got that resilience of infrastructure, you've got you've got the capacity as well to respond financially, the impact is less. So investing in addressing the natural buffers, for example, to natural disasters is firstly investing now, as Mark said, will cost you much less in the future. There's also an opportunity for the multiplier effects that are actually linked to nature, and Mark referred to some of the work that UNECA has already been doing, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which has shown, for example, that in some of the case studies in Kenya, we get over 300% more value addition by investing in natural parks than we would do, for example, in fossil fuel sectors. In South Africa, it's 270%. Better return on investment. So but these, I think what we do need to recognize in these two examples, these are countries that already have a base in those sectors. If you go to another country, and I'll take the example of the DRC, where they don't necessarily have that base infrastructure for ecotourism in the same way, the return on investment on parks might be less. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, but it's what you do first. Because as you said, if you say you're going to invest, you're going to come with a natural capital investment, the farmer or the fisherman they want to know how that's going to increase their income. That's their first question. And if I use the example of what we did in Seychelles, we developed a fisheries master plan, and that was what we used to mobilize the financing for the Blue Bond. And that involved certain changes in terms of how fisheries were managed, certain quotas on certain at-risk species. By doing that, it had impacts on the fishermen, but they wanted to see, well, what does it mean for me in terms of my incomes? And what we did try to do, we linked the Blue Bond to allowing on lending for investment in the cold chain, in processing facilities, so that the fishermen and the fishing community would be able to be more involved in the processing aspect and thereby increasing their share of value addition. In other countries where you've had these kind of investments coming, if you don't see the livelihood first, meaning if you don't see the result in terms of jobs, then they will start to question what you're trying to do.
Exactly.
And we have to translate that in real terms in jobs.
Banks are ready to finance, but what they want is to minimize the risks. So if Fonerwa can really support on that aspect, then definitely we'll be engaging with those. Another thing is really capacity building. Banks, what are doing is really to now, their staff, to get knowledge really to understand those aspects. Because if you're a credit analyst, most of the time you don't really understand what is happening in agriculture. So it's kind of to have a specialist in agriculture that is covering also those staff in credit.
I think African financial institutions, with great respect, are at the beginning of a journey on a lot of things. In many cases, they're at the beginning of the journey on ESG as well. But I do think there is significant interest, especially when they're considering the scale of the risks and the opportunities, in coming together to better understand how to manage those risks in the long term. So there are the physical risks to do with what happens when all the land that you have as collateral suddenly dries up and becomes worthless. But it's also the transitional risks when consumers' behavior changes and when policy changes in response to consumer behavior, and suddenly markets that they were lending into don't exist anymore, and that's very, very expensive. So what we want to do is to create a mechanism to allow financial institutions to come together, to learn from specialists and to share knowledge about how to deal with these collective risks. The Africa Natural Capital Alliance, which my colleague Kelvin's going to talk about, which we're promoting today.
You're absolutely right. The rising debt is a huge challenge for Africa currently. It's shot up in the pandemic. And that's partly because even though there has been mobilization of financing, including from partners internationally, the scale is absolutely inadequate. The per capita in low-income countries, two-thirds of which are in Africa, the per capita mobilization of resources was only $57 per capita, compared to the advanced economies where it was over $11,000 per capita. So there's a very limited ability to raise finance, and a lot of countries have gone to capital markets to raise additional finance, and you've got a consequence, the debt to GDP ratios in Africa have shot up. I think that certainly among the most fragile countries, there has to be, under the common framework of the G20, there has to be a format, and unfortunately I think this question is not addressed enough, where there is some form of debt reduction. Because among fragile countries, they will really struggle otherwise to move past that debt overhang which is building up. I think among the countries that have the capacity, which have a stronger infrastructure, and there are a number of African countries that are actually in that position, it's just a question of looking at the long-term risk and reaching, I think, the right levels of growth, and particularly if we can look at unlocking some of the opportunities from Africa's natural capital, we could see actually increased growth, and I think that would address the risk. The other point related to your question is that there are some types of investments and infrastructure which can be done by the private sector, but there are some which are simply, it has to be the state. So even on energy, a lot can be done by the private sector, but most of the time you need the basic infrastructure, the transmission lines, the distribution A lot of it has to be done, at least at the basic level, by governments. And so we need to solve this issue of governments being able to access that base investment. And it's the same with natural capital. If we can't provide clean cooking options for populations, there's going to be continued deforestation because people will be depending on those resources. So we need, if I take an example from the DRC, the return on investment in investing in irrigation is 500%. Right? And a lot of that has to be done by government, so we need to unlock the ability for governments to be able to invest in those sectors, and that will further reduce the risk. The investment in irrigation can allow for more efficient agriculture, which will therefore reduce as well the impact on deforestation and therefore better protect natural capital.
I think, obviously you've got to sort of pick your interlocutor, right? You've got to decide who you're going to talk to and really go for the decision makers and the people who have influence in the first instance. So what pains me is actually when you see well-intentioned initiatives by governments who sort of get the fact that climate change is an issue and that we need to protect nature, only they're making the wrong choices. They're planting the wrong kinds of tree. And that, as the IPCC report is saying, is actually creating more damage than it's helping. So I think the important conversations do need to happen within government levels, within, if you will, the more sophisticated elites, because those are the people who can drive change. And I do think that's really important. And obviously we can't expect everybody who's focused on a particular livelihood to completely change everything. There is a transitional issue there. But I wanted to come back particularly to the point that was being made about regulation and legislation, because the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, which is sort of underpinning the discussion that we're having today, is all about trying to align global finance behind nature-based risks, nature-based opportunities. That's fundamentally what it's pointing to. But in the area of green finance policy and regulation, there are very specific things that can be done that I don't think people fully sort of get, and those could be constitutional reforms to mandate tree cover, for example, as Kenya has, but most other countries don't have. It could be around sort of green bond guidelines and listing rules. It could be around, green finance, green fiscal policy incentives. So I do think there's an opportunity for us all to rally around the idea that there are very specific green finance pieces of regulation and legislation that can be done while all those other things need to take place at the same time. Very specific things that are fixable. And I think we need a continental effort around that. One of our initiatives, called the Africa Green Finance Coalition, aims to do that. But we also then need to link it into all the work that we're also doing on nature.
So when it comes to investing in natural capital, and when she's saying that, is it becoming riskier to invest in it? The answer is no. The reason being is natural capital is split into three. It's different types of services and it's different types of elements that you're going to be investing into. So you've got your provisioning services, which is your basic natural capital provisions that nature provides you with. That's your water, that's food, your land. And then you've got your ecosystem services. So that's your hydraulic system, that's your atmospheric systems. And basically climate change is a failure in not managing our atmospheric system. And the impact of that, obviously, is the extreme weather events that are coming. And then the last one is cultural provisions, and that's protecting biodiversity. So there's various elements and directions to which we can proactively promote and catalyze finance towards. But when it comes to investing in natural capital in areas that are privy to physical risk because of climate change, I think the answer there is what are we as a financial sector going to then do to help those areas in terms of adapting or mitigating against those extreme weather impacts that may happen in that region. So it's financing the adaptation of it or the mitigation of it. And obviously every system is going to have to adapt. We need to help our systems to regenerate again so that they do become self-sufficient again. So I don't think it's becoming more riskier. I think it's a matter of us understanding what it is that we've done to those various natural capital systems and how can we best address the negative impacts that we've had. And where we can't do anything about it, the answer would then be how do we adapt and move forward.